Hi, my name is Erin. I make my own clothes and I also design sewing patterns so that other people can make their own clothes. And this is the tutorial for my Viper top pattern. This is a very quick project and I would say very beginner friendly, especially if you're a little bit adventurous and you're okay with going slow. If you haven't already picked up the pattern, you can find it linked below. In the instructions, I include guidance on how to pick your size, how to pick your fabric, what kind of adjustments to make if you have a bigger bust. And yeah, you can follow along with the instructions or you can just follow this video tutorial. It's up to you. Let's get started.
First, we're going to place both front and back pattern pieces right sides together. Pin them together and sew them with a 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance, and remember to use a zigzag stitch. Once those side seams are done, it's actually a really good time to try on your top for size to see if you need to bring it in at all. Then you can finish with a zigzag stitch or serger and press those seams gently towards the back. Next, we're going to do the exact same thing with the bralette pieces. Place them right sides together, pin them and sew them with a 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. If you're not making the bralette, you can skip ahead. Otherwise, let's keep going. For the bralette side seams, you still need to finish with a zigzag stitch or serger, but then I want you to gently press those seams towards the front. This will give us less bulk when we attach the bralette to the main bodice later. With the bralette inside out, fold the hem up by 1/2 inch or 1.3 centimeters. You can use an iron. I'm just using a piece of elastic that I know is 1.3 centimeters and pinning around. Also, just a side note, ignore the fact that my side seams are unfinished. My serger broke while I was filming this, so they're unfinished. Yours should be finished. Just don't worry about it. Then we're going to sew around the hem as close to the edge of that fold as possible, leaving a 2 inch or 5 centimeter gap, because this will become the channel that we feed our elastic through. Now you can attach a safety pin to one end of your elastic and use it to feed the elastic through the channel you've created. Make sure you secure the loose end of the elastic so that you don't lose it in the tunnel. Once the elastic is threaded through the channel, make sure it isn't twisted, then overlap the two ends by about 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters and then secure them with a zigzag stitch. Now you can pop that exposed elastic into the channel, make it all nice and even, and sew that hole closed. Now take your main bodice and turn it right side out so that you can put the bralette inside and pin them together wrong sides together. Start by attaching them at the side seams, then the notches, then the points. The idea is to attach the bralette to the bodice all the way around the armholes and all the way around the necklines. Attach the bralette to the bodice with 4 separate rows of stitches. So sew along the left armhole, then the front neckline, followed by the right armhole, and then the back neckline. And we're going to be doing that at a 1/4 inch or 1/2 centimeter seam allowance. You don't need to sew all the way to the end of the pointed edges, just get as close as you can. And you can see even at 5x speed, I'm taking this nice and slow. When it comes to the neckline, you're going to want to slow right down so that you can lift your presser foot and pivot around the curves of the keyhole. Just make sure that it's all nice and neat. Now you should have a bodice with a built-in bra attached. Turn your top right side out so that we can get ready to attach the binding. You should have 4 binding pieces total, 1 short one, 1 medium one, and 2 long ones. Let's start with the short one, which is the right armhole binding. First, carefully fold the right armhole binding piece in half so that you can cut a small notch in the center. With the main bodice right side out, align the center notch of the right armhole binding piece with the right hand side seam and pin it in place. Then you can continue pinning from the center outwards, stretching the binding piece to fit around the curves of the armhole. Always make sure that you're just stretching the binding piece and not the armhole itself. Sew the binding to the armhole with a 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. When you're done, you're going to want to carefully press the seam allowance up towards the binding piece. Fold the raw edge of the binding down by 1 centimeter, then fold it over the seam allowance towards the wrong side, encasing the seam allowance within the binding, keeping all of the raw edges tucked in. The goal is to have it folded over the seam so that you can't see the previous stitch line at all. And if you're going to be top stitching this with a twin needle, which I do recommend, then I would suggest putting the pins on the right side of the fabric. It just makes it 10 times easier to remove them while you're sewing later. If you prefer to use clips instead of pins, you can totally use clips here as well. I just only have really crap ones that break when you open them, so I'm using pins. And when you flip it over to the right side, it should look a little something like this. Now, still with the right side facing out, use a twin needle to top stitch the binding closed. And for a twin needle, remember to use a straight stitch. Sew as close as you can to the seam without going over it. Using a twin needle here is going to provide the cleanest finish, but if you don't have access to a twin needle, a zigzag stitch or lightning bolt stitch will also work just fine. Just take this step nice and slow. Goal is to catch the other side of the binding underneath. Now we're going to repeat those steps with the left armhole binding, starting by folding it in half so that we can cut a little notch, and then matching that notch with the side seam. Pin them together right sides facing, and then start at the center and gently stretch the binding to fit around the armhole. Then sew in place with a 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. Now that the binding is attached, we'll once again fold it down by 1 centimeter, then fold it over the seam allowance towards the wrong side, encasing the seam allowance within the binding, keeping all of those raw edges tucked in. Make sure the folded binding is completely covering the previous stitch line. Then just continue pinning all the way around the armhole using as many pins as you need. Using my trusty twin needle, I'm going to top stitch the binding as close to the seam as possible, making sure that I am catching the folded binding underneath. And remember, just take this step nice and slow. Now, following the natural direction of the keyhole neckline, I'm going to cut the ends of the binding back into points. Next, fold one of the neckline binding pieces in half so that you can cut a small notch in the center, and align it with the notch in the center of the neckline. You might find it helpful to lightly press the binding pieces to create a guideline for your stitches. If you're a super beginner, then I definitely recommend doing that, and there are instructions on how to do so in the instruction manual. Otherwise, keep pinning the binding to the neckline right sides together, just like the armhole binding. Start at the center and gently stretch the binding piece to fit around the curves of the neckline. Then slowly sew the binding to the neckline with a 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance, stopping to pivot around the curve of the keyhole. Now, just like the armhole bindings, we're going to lightly press the seam allowance towards the binding and then fold the binding down by 1 centimeter. The difference with the neckline binding is that you have the ties, so you can just fold the raw edges in by 1 centimeter and then fold them in half again to meet in the middle. But if you want something more tidy at the end of your ties, then I recommend just cutting the corners off that short end of the tie. Then you can fold the short edge of the tie down before folding as usual. This makes sure that there's no exposed raw edges. It can be a little bit fiddly, but you got this. For for the actual neckline, do it exactly the same way you did the armhole bindings. Fold it over the seam allowance towards the wrong side, encase the seam allowance within that binding, and keep all of those raw edges tucked in. And don't forget that we want to cover that previous stitch line with the binding. With your twin needle, if you're using one, start at the end of one tie and top stitch the folded edges together, sew as close to the edge as you can. Depending on your fabric, these little ties might slip and slide around, so I just grabbed some tweezers and I held them next to my presser foot just to keep that tie in a straight line. When you reach the neckline, continue top stitching the binding as close to the seam as possible, making sure that you're catching all of that folded binding underneath. You may want to slow down so that you can lift your presser foot and pivot around the curve of the keyhole. Then just continue down to the end of the other tie. If you find that your ties are curling as you're sewing them, don't worry, you can just give them a nice steamy press afterwards and let them cool while they're laying flat. Then just repeat those steps on the back neckline. With both necklines complete, it's now time to hem. Gently press the hem up by 0.6 inches or 2 centimeters, being mindful not to stretch or drag the fabric, just press it lightly. If you're hemming with a twin needle, which I do recommend, flip the top right side out and place the pins horizontally as close as you can get to the raw edge of the fabric that's been pressed up on the inside. This gives us a guideline that we can use to sew later. If you're using a regular needle with a zigzag stitch, you can just keep the garment inside out and pin and sew as you normally would. Using a twin needle, use your pins as a guide to top stitch the hem in place. I like to sew with my needle in the center position and keep the pins in line with the center of my presser foot. This makes it a lot easier to keep it straight and make sure that I'm catching all of that raw edge underneath. And that is it. Tie your ties together at the shoulder in a double knot and you are good to go. I fucking love this top.